keep in mind that we are in the second half of the book of Joshua, and as a consequence, we're not talking about how the land is being conquered. We're talking about how the land is being divided. So let's look at two key points to think about this morning. First of all, sometimes when we make difficult decisions in life, it's good to look to the Lord for advice. We're going to see that play out with a decision that's made about the daughters of Zelophehad. And the other key point is that in order to obtain God's gifts, a lot of times we have to exert effort on our part. And we're going to see that play out with what the tribe of Manasseh is going to make a request of for Joseph later on in the chapter. So again, we're looking at Joshua chapter 17, again, thinking about the importance of the tribe of Manasseh. So first of all, we want to look at a brief overview of the tribe. And first of all, we know, of course, that Manasseh, along with Ephraim, was one of the grandsons of Jacob. He was a son of Joseph. We talked about last time that as a consequence of that relationship, God had blessed, or Jacob had specifically blessed the sons of Joseph. In chapter 41, we saw that play out. Again, we've already talked about that incident and how that happened. Even though Manasseh was technically the firstborn, he received the second. He essentially received the second portion in large part because of what happened in that instance. Of course, the following chapter, we read about Jacob blessing the Josephites, or the sons of Joseph more generally, but of course, in chapter 41, we see them being blessed separately. So when we go back to Genesis 41, we are given the name, or at least the meaning of the name Manasseh, and thus the meaning of the tribe Manasseh. But if we look at Genesis 41, verse 51, the name Manasseh means literally to forget. And I know that a lot of us probably at times would probably need to be called Manasseh because of how many times we forget things, but at least if you're like me. But the point is that the name Manasseh means to forget. And when we look at Genesis 41 and verse 51, we understand why Joseph decides to call his firstborn son Manasseh. As we talked about, the naming of those two sons was in large part due to Joseph reflecting on how God had protected him up to that point in his life. And that was certainly true with the name Manasseh. We talked about last time the name Ephraim simply referred to that God had allowed Joseph to be fruitful in the land of Egypt, despite that he had been sold into slavery. But in Genesis 41 and verse 51, notice that it says that Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. So there, of course, the name Manasseh, we typically think about forgetting. We think about that in a negative light. But in essence, the idea of forgetting here is kind of in a good sense, right? Joseph obviously had, up to that point, remembered all that his brethren had done to him. And from Joseph's perspective, this name was essentially to honor God's provision or God's protection in large part from his brother's wrath. And brothers there should be plural. Again, keep in mind that we know, of course, that Joseph was hated by his brethren. Really wasn't his fault. There was the plot to initially kill Joseph because of that level of hatred. But then, of course, we know that his brethren decided to sell him into slavery. But we know, of course, that the point being is that was a very tumultuous, difficult situation for Joseph to go through. And naturally, we know that Joseph does indeed encounter his brethren again. But the point was, all the problems that Joseph had gone through with his brethren, God had saw him through that. And so again, the name then is given to remind Joseph of what God had done for him. And that, of course, would the sons of Manasseh eventually become heirs of the tribe of Manasseh. So that's what the name means. Again, that's kind of an overview for it. So when we flash forward back to chapter 17, we are going to see that, of course, the land is divided up. Again, at this point, Manasseh falls in the third line, or at least in the third tribe to have their lot divided up. Again, keep in mind that this is all a process that God is overseeing. And as we talked about, that whole process of dividing the land by lot with God overseeing it would give this whole process divine authority. And the point of that is, again, in the future to try to help lessen the possibility of outright wars between the tribes fighting over land. So we got the eastern tribe of Manasseh. That's listed for us in Joshua chapter 17 and verse 1. And again, we have to take into consideration that this is a situation in which, like Reuben and Gad, the eastern tribe of Manasseh was divided up prior to the events of what we're talking about now. The eastern tribe of Manasseh was divided up under the leadership of Moses. We have kind of talked about that, but that was part of a process in which the Israelites were dealing with some of the inhabitants east of the Jordan River who basically tried to block their entrance into Canaan. And if we go back to Deuteronomy chapter 3, we read about the fact that in the aftermath of the defeats of Sihon and Og, that Reuben, Gad, and part of the tribe of Manasseh made a request of Moses and asked essentially for this land that was east of the Jordan River. And in Deuteronomy chapter 3 and verse 13, we read about the fact that that Moses, through God's direction, divides that part of the land up and gives the eastern tribe of Manasseh a couple of important regions that we see in Joshua 17 that are listed up here, Bashan and Gilead. We'll talk about Gilead in a minute, but Bashan, we've talked about, was an area that became synonymous with strength. As we talked about the passage from the book of Psalms, the bulls of Bashan that surrounded me. Again, a messianic prophecy. Again, but the idea of Bashan was strength. We'll say more about Gilead in a moment, or now at least. Gilead was a very famous location in Israel for a couple of reasons. One reason why Gilead becomes important as it's connected to the tribe of Manasseh is because this is the main location where the King's Highway ran through. We read about the King's Highway as the Israelites are moving up in the book of Deuteronomy toward entering into the land of Canaan. It was one of the bigger trading routes that would run through Israel. So it was very important from an economic perspective. But it was also important because of what we might think about when we think about the term Gilead. And Gilead, of course, is kind of remembered as a place of refuge. Again, when we think about the time of David, again, when David fled from Absalom, he fled east of the Jordan River and basically for a while lived in Gilead. And so Gilead comes to be identified with the idea of finding a place of refuge. Now, in our psalm books, we have a song, and correct me if I'm wrong, but did you think to pray There's a reference in that psalm to something that's called the balm of Gilead. And the balm of Gilead kind of has the same idea of refuge, but the balm of Gilead was supposedly a type of ointment that came from a plant that would basically heal a person. And it was basically a very famous form of medicine in the Old Testament. That's why in that song, when it talks about balm of Gilead, did you borrow? The reference there is about the idea of praying, in a sense, being a form of medicine. Medicine heals us. Prayer obviously does a lot for us, right? That's the idea. If somebody would read for us Jeremiah 8 and verse 22.
Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Why then is not the health of the daughter of my people recovered?
So there, Jeremiah is talking about what the Israelites, what the Jews in his day would have understood, and that is the concept of Gilead being connected to health, obviously connected to physician. But of course, the problem in the days of Jeremiah was that the people were not faithful to God, and it didn't matter how much physical medicine that they had. Their problems were not going to go away until they got their spiritual selves corrected. But again, if you notice in verse 1, it says that Gilead and Bashan fall into the hands, or they're part of the regions that are given to Manasseh. And Bashan, very important. We still reference it with the Lord's Supper. Gilead, still very important. Then, we have references to Gilead in some of the songs that we sing. Maybe that's the reason why I bring that up, is because it kind of connects to something that we do based on what we're reading. This is supposedly the plant that the balm of Gilead comes from, and exactly how they go about the process of taking that plant, turning it into an ointment. I'm not an expert on that, but it still is thought to be a very powerful ointment or medicine that is used, and here at least it's connected to the tribe of Manasseh. The other thing that I will say in verse 1 is that it says that Machir, the firstborn of Manasseh, the father of Gilead, that he was given a lot, and it says it was because he was a man of war. And what I will simply say is that if you go back to Genesis 49 and verse 24, when Jacob talks about the prosperity of Joseph's descendants, in verse 24, he talks about the fact that Joseph's descendants would be known for their strength. And that probably then is a direct reference to Machir, who will kind of play in this role, because we're going to see that the tribe of Manasseh is going to fight for more land, is the point. But verse 1 is talking about the eastern tribe of Manasseh, and essentially what's going to follow is the division of the western tribe of Manasseh. So we've got this incident here in we've got the children listed, the rest of the children of Manasseh listed in verse 2. But in verse 3, we have this interesting situation develop where we've got a case of how will we handle this difficult decision about how land is divided up. So let's look at verses 3 through 6. It says that, but Zelophehad, the son of Hepher, the son of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, had no sons, but only daughters. And these are the names of his daughters: Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. And they came near before Eleazar the priest, before Joshua the son of Nun, and before the rulers, saying, the Lord commanded Moses to give us an inheritance among our brothers. Therefore, according to the commandment of the Lord, he gave them an inheritance among their brothers. So this is obviously a unique situation. We're not outright told this, but obviously the implication up to this point is that when the land is being divided up, it's being divided up among the heads of the household, right? Or it's being divided up among the men that are the leaders of these tribes. But here's a situation in which Zelophehad has no sons, yet he has an inheritance in the land. And so how is his land going to be divided up? Here we've got the occasion where the four daughters come up and say, look, our father received an inheritance. We have no husbands, therefore we should get the land. Now, obviously, that's important because this is a unique situation. Historically, at least, land has and historically, inheritances in particular, but also especially land, typically passes down from the father to the sons. So what do you do about this situation that is obviously not conventional? Well, this request that the daughters of Zelophehad are making goes back to a decision that Moses had to make. And we want to look at that. We want to go back and look at that for a moment. But this is a decision that Moses had already earlier made with the input of God in Numbers 27, verses 1 through 11. This was a unique situation. This was a situation that we see Moses by himself did not have a direct answer for. And Moses' response was that I'm going to ask God what we should do about it. Now, we're going to pick up in verse 6, but from verses 1 through 5, we see the same story play out. We're also given the important note that Zelophehad himself had not been caught up in the company with Korah, which, of course, what had happened to Korah? How had he died? Yeah, remember that Korah and his sons tried to launch a rebellion against Moses, that God caused the earth to swallow them up, and they were punished for that reason. So the point is that from the daughters of Zelophehad, when their father died, their father did not die in that rebellion, and thus retained possession of, his descendants would retain possession of the land in Canaan. And so they bring this situation to Moses, and as it says in verse 5, Moses brought their case before the Lord. And then notice what is said here in verse 6. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, the daughters of Zelophehad speak what is right. You shall surely give them a possession of inheritance among their father's brothers, and cause the inheritance of their father to pass to them. And you shall speak to the children of Israel, saying, if a man dies and has no son, then you shall cause his inheritance to pass to his daughter. If he has no daughter, then you shall give his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if his father has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to the relative closest to him in his family, and he shall possess it. And it shall be to the children of Israel a statute of judgment, just as the Lord commanded Moses. Now, when Moses is brought with this situation, again, he's the leader at this point. Some people would think, if I'm the leader of these people, it's within my power to make the final decision about what we should do. That's one of the reasons why in our government, our executive branch is led by one man, the President of the United States, because sometimes we need one person to make a decision very quickly. And sometimes there is wisdom in that. But in this particular case, Moses looks at this situation, recognizes that he doesn't really have the right answer to it. And so his mindset is, well, let me consult with God. Let us consult with God and figure out what the correct answer is. And obviously, the decision that God makes is something that's going to be a statute of judgment. In other words, it's going to basically be a rule moving forward. And the point is that this controversy is obviously handled in the correct way. There's no dispute at this point. because no one's going to criticize God for the decision that he made. Now, the application obviously for us, and obviously the application for the world in general, is that if a lot of people approached this issue in the same way, thinking about maybe a subject like religion, right? What does it mean to properly practice Christianity? What does it mean to properly organize the church? What does it mean to properly carry out the worship of the church? If more people simply said, well, let's see what God says about the matter, you would have a whole lot more unity, is the point. This could have been a situation that could have caused division in Moses' day, but Moses consulted the Lord, and you have a proper outcome because of what God has said. That's what Joshua does in verse 4. He's, of course, reminded about this situation, and Joshua said, well, if God commanded Moses to do this, this is what we should do. Again, you think about how much better the world would be if people, when it came to their religious practices, simply said, doesn't matter what I think, we need to consult God about what's the right thing to do in this particular situation. For us, we could also take the application from this that, whenever we are brought with a question about the Bible, if we don't necessarily have a great answer, there's nothing wrong with saying, give me some time, let me consult the Bible, let me pray about it, because that's going to be the better option than giving a quick answer, and that answer might be wrong, is the point. In other words, I think there's a lot of wisdom in how they handled that situation. I will say that in American history, again, one of the more famous stories that people like to read about in American history are obviously the Salem witch trials. And one of the theories behind the Salem witch trials was that a lot of the male inhabitants in Salem village were concerned that the property was going to be passed on to women, and so they had women accuse people of being witches as a way to gain their property. Point is that it can be kind of controversial in more ancient times for women to get land. But again, here the point is the decision is made correctly because the Lord had a hand in it. And I'll say there at the bottom point, this is also going to be the reason why Manasseh is going to be one of the larger tribes. Again, if you just look at by land size, Manasseh is right up there with Judah. I think Manasseh is actually technically bigger land-wise than Judah. At least it is on this map. As you see, verse 5 and 6, 10 shares as a consequence fell to Manasseh, and that's going to help define the western part of the tribe of Manasseh. And so in verse 7, and we're not going to talk a lot about this because we talked about it with Ephraim last time, but verses 7 through 13, again, just gives us the dimension of the tribe. And we look at verse 11. At the end of verse 11, it says in general about these dimensions that they are very hilly regions. And part of the reason why that note is given to us is because of what we read about in verses 14 through 18, which we'll get to that in a moment. But again, the dimensions of the western part of the tribe, that's what is given to us in verses 7 through 13. Now, what is interesting is there in verse 13, we are told that they failed to drive out the inhabitants. And it happened when the children of Israel grew strong that they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not utterly drive them out. So this is not the first time we read about this. Won't be the last time that we read about this. But one of the issues that we see play out in the book of Joshua is that sometimes the Israelites do not completely wipe out the Canaanites as they were expected to do. And in this particular case, we're probably given the reason why they didn't do that. As it says in verse 13, instead of trying to utterly drive them out or destroy them, they saw an economic benefit in the Canaanites by causing them to serve as forced laborers, or in other words, turning them into slaves, which obviously was a sign of the children of Israel growing strong because they had the ability to do that. But the reason why verse 13 is given to us is to help explain what problem that's about to happen. Why is it bad that the Canaanites are not being eliminated and instead being turned into slaves? So land will become a problem in a minute. There's a much bigger problem, though, with what the Israelites are doing here. Something Moses had already warned them about that they were not listening to in this passage. Yeah, they'll adopt their ways. And that's the reason verse 13 is given to us. Manasseh, again, a very powerful tribe, yet what they saw in the Canaanites was an opportunity to exploit them, to use them for free labor. And the problem that God has with it is based on what Moses had already said in Deuteronomy 12, verses 29 through 30, where if you go back and look at that passage, essentially Moses warned the people that if you tolerate, if you do not get rid of them, one day you will adopt their ways, which of course was a reference to them adopting idolatry. And as we're going to see in the book of Judges, the reason why you have the book of Judges and a reason why you have a lot of the events of the book of Judges is in large part because of problems created by verse 13 of Joshua 17. We're going to see the people adopt the ways of the Canaanites, adopt foreign gods. That's why there are a ton of conflicts that we read about in the book of Judges, and why you have the judges to begin with. So that note is important because it's setting us up for what we read about in the book of Judges. But then we have this final issue, and this is this request for more land. If somebody would read for us verses 14 through 18.
Then the sons of Joseph spoke to Joshua, saying, Why have you given me only one lot and one portion for an inheritance, since I am a numerous people whom the Lord has thus far blessed? And Joshua said to them, If you are a numerous people, go up to the forest and clear a place for yourself there in the land of the Perizzites and of the Rephaim, since the hill country of Ephraim is too narrow for you. And the sons of Joseph said, The hill country is not enough for us, and all the Canaanites who live in the valley land have chariots of iron, both those who are in Bethshan and its towns, and those who are in the valley of Jezreel. And Joshua spoke to the house of Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh, saying, You are a numerous people and of great power. You shall not have one lot only, but the hill country shall be yours. For though it is a forest, you shall clear it, and to its farthest borders it shall be yours. For you shall drive out the Canaanites, even though they have chariots of iron, and though they are strong.
All right, so verses 14 through 18. We've got this situation where Ephraim and Manasseh, again, the sons of Joseph, come up and they ask Joshua, look, the land that we've been given is not enough. And as the verse indicates, verse 14, the argument that they're making is that they have too many people trying to live on too little of land, which naturally could cause all sorts of problems. Now, if you go back and look look when the tribes are numbered earlier in the Old Testament, I believe it's the book of Numbers. If you just do the math, Manasseh and Ephraim were not the biggest tribes population-wise. But at least they feel like the land that they've been given is not enough for the number of people. And obviously that could tie in with the fact that the Canaanites that they have not eliminated, they also have to provide land, or they have to provide food and things like that for them. And so Joshua's answer, if you, and keeping in mind that all this land that the tribes are getting, this is the gift of God for them. But Joshua's response to this request for more land is simply, you know what, if you want more land, and obviously God has a hand in this, but, here's more land that you can take, but you're going to have to do some work yourself, right? Go up to the forest country, clear a place for yourself in the land of the Perizzites and the giants, since the mountains of Ephraim are too confined for you. So in other words, if you want more land, God through Joshua is saying, look, you have the opportunity to acquire more land, but you're going to have to work for it. You're going to have to clear out the forest. You're also going to have to deal with the inhabitants of the people that are there. And as Joshua said, since the mountains of Ephraim are too confined for you. But verse 16, it says, the children of Joseph said, the mountain country is not enough for us. And all the Canaanites who dwell in the land of the valley have chariots of iron, both those who are of Bethshean and its towns, and those who are of the valley of Jezreel. And on this map, it doesn't have it located here, but the valley of Jezreel is approximately in this area. And that's why it says in verse 16, they're not just concerned about maintaining control of the mountain country, but they're also worried about trying to exert control over the valley of Jezreel. And so why would the valley of Jezreel be important to two tribes who primarily live in the hill country? Why would the valley of Jezreel then become important for two tribes who primarily live in the hill or mountain country? What type of commerce? Farming, agriculture, right? Tennessee's famous song, Rocky Top. It's one of the lyrics. Corn doesn't grow on Rocky Top because the dirt's too rocky by far, right? It's hard to carry out agriculture in the hill country. The hill country is obviously great for defense, but the problem is when you have a lot of hills, and we know this, when you think about the Appalachian Mountains versus the rest of the South, Appalachian Mountains, you don't have a whole lot of room for agriculture. And so that's why the valley of Jezreel is important. That's why Ephraim and Manasseh are concerned. They recognize that they need to have access to the valley of Jezreel because that's where food is going to come from, is the point. And so they're requesting permission essentially to deal with the Canaanites that live within that area. And naturally, the tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim are concerned because the Canaanites have iron chariots and are strong. They are advanced militarily. And so as a consequence, they want permission to go in and drive them out, and Joshua does that. Of course, the point is that if you want this land, you have to work for it, or you have to do something for it. As Christians, we recognize we want eternal life, but God still expects us to continue to be faithful and to work for Him, is the point. We're out of time. Is there any final comments or things that we want to address based on what we've said?
A whole lot easier to complain than to do something about it. If I'm going to complain about something, I need to try to find a solution or be willing to do my part instead of just complaining.
Right. Right. Yeah, and as this plays out, we'll see them act. But thank you for your time and your attention this morning. We'll pick up in chapter 8.